we're going to start another round table. It's the fourth round table. It's all about enabling and constraining factors for food sufficiency in Mediterranean city regions. And we're going to talk about social and technological innovations. And the leitmotif of our round table that we put together all together, or the panel members and myself, is to try and identify how locality and being local can help technological innovations. We have with us Abdelmajid SAIDI, who's an economist, a lecturer and researcher at Meknès University in Morocco. We have Claire Lesur-Dumoulin. She is a research engineer at INRA Alénya. We have Christelle Recherche. Is that how I pronounce it? Who is president of the Commission for the Valorisation of Production, the Agrifood sector and short circuits in Provence. And we have Lamia ARFA, who is an economist, assistant lecturer at Tunis Institut for Agronomical Research. So we'll kick off with Abdelmajid. First of all, thank you very much, Esther, for inviting me here to participate in this seminar. And I agreed to talk about SIAL, but I didn't know that there were going to be the founding members in the room here. The SAIDI here, we've been working together, and he founded the concept, and I worked on it a few years ago. And SIAD is the result of a closing in of two changes. That's two evolutions. One is to do with agriculture. Could you... There is the founding member here, but there are other people who don't know what SIAL is. Perhaps you could give us a word or two about what SIAL is. Okay, SIAL is localized agro-food system, so we call it by its acronym here. And it was developed by Meknès, notamment, and Denis Rocky-Ducherdin, who founded this concept. It's a agro-food system that is local. So as I was saying, yes, so that the first concept is agro-food systems, and the other concept is protecting land. And so we broaching social, cultural, economic aspects and natural aspects, of course. It also enables us to highlight the central link in the food chain, i.e. the farmers. So the members are farmers, and with all of their knowledge, industrialists, processors, consumers. And I really want to stress the last point, because consumers make SIAL stand out from other concepts, and also public players. We can also talk of complementary players, such as tourism professionals, who can play a role in the SIAL. So, what are we looking for when we're researching in the SIAL? Well, we are identifying the degree of closeness that can exist on a territory between the players in a sector. I'm talking about closeness in its three dimensions: geographical dimension, organizational, how complementary the players can be, and institutional as well, sharing values such as trust. This notion was developed thanks to work carried out in the south for once. So it's important to note that they come from the south. And it was based on work carried out in southern countries and in Latin America by Meknès and others. That work highlighted the important role of artisan protagonists in countries such as Cameroon, Mali, in Latin America, with a slightly different concept of rural agriculture in Latin America. So most of the units are family units. They specialize in producing a foodstuff. So having read a lot of work on SIALs, I have managed to define a typology of these SIALs. You can talk about agricultural and industrial SIALs. So the agricultural SIALs are in a rural zone where there is a very close link with agriculture, the origins of agricultural produce, very little industrialization, very little processing, and that is what gives the value to these products. And also, we have industrial SIALs, and those are the processors, the industrialists, who are the central link in that type of SIAL. I've been working on the example of Bisharia in Algeria. No raw materials, they import the raw materials, and a food industry has been built in Bishaya, in a mountain zone, and they import all of the raw materials. So we have a geographical concentration of agro-food businesses. And there are two other dimensions. There's the dimension of organization and institutions on which this type of SIAL is founded. Is it possible to shift from one to the other? Yes. Can you shift from an agricultural SIAL to an industrial one? Yes. That is the case, for example, in Meknès. There's an olive tree sector in Meknès, which started off as an agricultural SIAL, very traditional, and it's shifting towards an industrial SIAL, where the processors, the big-scale processors, dominate the system. So, to satisfy the needs of these processors, because they have huge capacity, it meant that the agricultural production had to be increased by intensive practices and by importing plants and planting them in the most fertile sections of the land, to the detriment of cereals, which is the base of our diet in Morocco. So these imported plants, such as one from Spain, after 3 years, are already producing. But after 15, 20 years, you have to rip them out of the ground again, which is not the case of the Moroccan species. So you have to rip it out of the ground, but it has destroyed the soil. And so you have to leave that soil undisturbed for 15 years before you can plant anything else there. So this olive tree sector is part of one of our projects, and all of its production is for export. It's all part of a Green Morocco project, which is a state project based on 2 pillars. One is a pillar to modernize agriculture for export, and the second pillar is to help small-scale farmers, family farmers. However, after years, this green project started in 2008, 75% of the budgets is reserved for the large-scale agriculture, the modern agriculture. And because of that, there's been a lot of yield, a lot of production, an overproduction of olives. which we could not export, despite all of the tax incentives by the Green Morocco government plan, because we didn't think ahead of time and realized there would be a lot of competition on the international market. So our neighbor Tunisia, Spain, and Italy are all olive producers. Most imported products, whether the plants or the machines, are imported from Italy and Spain at the outset. But downstream, we were not able to export our olives back to them. And given that, so how did your country react on a local scale? How did you adapt, or how did you cope with that situation? So we couldn't export our olives, and we couldn't even sell them locally, quite simply because the olive oil that is, of great quality, meets all the standards, is too expensive for the local population. And the Moroccan consumer prefers the former system, the old system, prefers to go directly to the farm, see the grower with an empty jug. However, we have noted a change. They have become more demanding in terms of the artisanal system, in terms of the price. They want acidity. They want to know how acidic the oil is. And now they can make a choice. They choose the older system rather than the new, more modern system. Some people just go and collect the olives themselves, and they have them processed in a facility elsewhere. So it really is a lot of modern innovation. So the older system is back in favor. It respects a lot of standards, health and safety standards, and which so it turns out to be a solution. I don't know if I've answered your question clearly. So in terms of the technological and technical innovations, what has been the impact of Green Morocco plan locally? Well, the Green Morocco plan was favorable to large-scale industrialization, so the techniques correspond to those people who are well-educated, whereas most of the farmers have practically never been to school. So how on earth can you spread these big, complicated, sophisticated technological innovations among people who've never been to school? 85% of them are women, and 7 out of 10 of them cannot read or write. So in my mind, it's quite impossible to disseminate modern technologies among small, traditional, family-scale farmers. We have to adapt the Green Morocco plan to the real situation down on the ground. These farmers know the land. The green plan is not decided by the local olive growers. It's decided by big industrialists and consulting companies, consultancy firms. So you're saying that the how is the local food system surviving? Well, the Green Morocco plan has destroyed the local food system. Trying to encouraging people to get rid of crops of cereal, to plant olive trees instead, has destroyed the local market. The olive trees were designed for the international market, not for the local market. So at the outset, these people were everyone knew each other. There were short supply chains. But with Green Morocco, that's not the only guilty party. There's also the urban spread, of course, which is to blame. But the chains and the circuits are growing longer. Okay, thank you for explaining that to us. I'd like to invite Claire to say a few words about the strategies that peri-urban farmers adopt which can strengthen the local food system. So it's a contrasting situation with the one Abdelmajid has just described. Hello, and thank you for inviting me here, Esther. I work at INRA in an experimental unit based near Perpignan, and we specialize on market gardening units. So my message pertains to market gardening operations. I also participate in a mixed technology and local food network. I contribute on a small scale to that, but I can tell you about what it does and what my unit does and the discussions that we've had within the framework of this mixed technology network, an RMT. So we have worked on a lot of information gathered from market gardeners around the city, and they say that there are many consequences to the length of the circuit. I am going to use the terms of a short chain and a local chain, because within the framework of my work, these local chains or circuits and short chains and circuits were more or less the same thing. So as the short chains are producing more, that means that tasks are becoming intensified. It's a question of producing and selling. And there is diversification of the circuits, because very frequently the market gardeners are not using a single circuit or a single type of circuit, but they are using a combination of several circuits. So this diversification increases the workload. It also increases the complexity of the thought processes and the design of these production units. And to manage all of this complication, the market gardener can sometimes have to group together certain types of crops and to implement technologies and techniques that work for several crops. Something which could work for tomatoes, cucumbers, and aubergine. Not they're too different, but tomatoes and aubergines, for example, can be managed in a similar way, and that means that they simplify the flows quite simply because there are health labels per type of vegetable, and if you're working on two types of vegetables, then you've got a complicated task, and this can reduce the number of crops which are produced. What I'm describing may sound to be something which they're just suffering without being able to do anything about it. However, if you're talking about selling in a short chain, that means that you have to produce something which corresponds to that short chain. And that often means diversification, diversifying your crops. This diversification can foster a reduction of entrance, and Catherine was talking earlier on about the advantages of diversification, and she described that in generally the advantages that can be gleaned in farming, notably in curbing the development of bioaggressors and better using mid-range resources. So diversification, but it's also important to admit that diversification isn't easy to manage. It involves a lot of change, a cultural change for the market gardeners, for the technicians, and even for us at an experimental station. And it's not only a question of increasing the number of crops, but also being able to enable them to live side by side in space and over time. Another component to keep in mind is that your production for a short chain has to respond to the needs and the desires of the consumers. The consumers may have quite high expectations in terms of taste, and they will perhaps tolerate these fruit and vegetables which look a bit strange, which aren't perfect, so they accept that. And that's a plus point, because that means that one can showcase varieties that are otherwise very difficult to sell on the longer chains. And it can also contribute to reducing the number of entrants. There's another point which is not on my diagram, and that's the fact that the relationship with the consumers can impact practices deployed by the farmer with a variable degree, depending on the type of short chain, if there's direct contact or not between the consumer and the producer. And it's important not to neglect the fact that what we saw yesterday with Catherine's presentation was this type of small holding. It can be part of a very complex network, and the networks can be a place where farmers can exchange their practices, and that itself can foster changes in the way they farm. So here we have an overlook, quite general, but I think it's important to point out that behind this overlook there is a lot of diversity in the way that farmers farm, because as I said earlier on, in the region of Perpignan and Toulouse, where we've been looking, the farms can use several circuits of sales. I've represented that on the screen here. It's the type of farm and the type of circuit which they'll use. We can see that there are market gardeners who use short distribution chains, but they use it to a limited degree. They also rely very heavily on longer chains. And others combine a hybrid strategy with shorter and longer chains with 50% for each. And there are other people who prefer to specialize on short circuits, and they specialize, for example, on a single circuit or a single type of circuit. What we have seen is that depending on the main strategy, the induced strategy on the diversity of what is produced and the number of entrants will change. In our sample, the more you use a shorter chain, the more diverse will be the crops, and the more you use, and the less entrants you use, the less inputs you use. So the diversity can be explained by many things. Of course, by land, which is available, labor costs, which of course, and that is also to be explained by the affinity between the market gardeners, who can be more or less comfortable managing 30 varieties, or whereas for some it will be a bit too difficult because it means that they're managing them badly because they're not giving each vegetable or fruit the necessary care and attention. It's also important to note that these market gardeners have all got different backgrounds, they've all got different plans. I've tried to sketch it out here on the screen. Some of them have always worked in long circuits before with specializations, and evolving towards shorter circuits can take them a bit more time, and short circuits can only occupy a little of their activity. We've also been able to see that once people are involved in these short chains, there are some variables in terms of the variety of their production. We've noted that, but there's also the opposite effect. People who are diversifying a lot, and people feel that they're overcome by all this diversification, the complexity that involves, and they're more comfortable dealing with a fewer number of species, and they find it easier to sell that. As far as sales and marketing are concerned, we saw two contrasting things which were happening. There are some which were focusing on a single type of circuit, which in terms of organization can be rather easy to manage. And on the other hand, for example, when they've got a lot of land, they would combine a lot of different types of circuit, 10 different chains and circuits that they would use. Let's not forget the fact that in certain cases we can see a redevelopment of sales and marketing in the longer chains, which can be explained for different reasons, because there are different economic opportunities, for example, but also because of the different personal life experiences and family events. it could be easier for them, for the market gardener, to return to a longer circuit. Well, it's really interesting what you've been saying. These short circuits, the long circuits, the complementarity which you've mentioned, concentrating on the market gardening activities in the peri-urban scale. We're going to pass on to our next speaker, who's going to say how that complementarity has come about in different cases. So I would just like you to end your speech.
Yes, you talk about choice of varieties, diversification of agricultural systems in farms that are in peri-urban areas focused on short circuits. Do you think that these innovations can also be possible in long circuits? Well, it seems that regarding the diversification of crops, this can also be relevant for long circuits, probably to a lesser degree of diversification, but I do not confront both on this point. And so there were tests, for example, with market gardeners to better understand how to organize the crops, also to better understand the interactions between crops. Regarding the varieties, as you mentioned, I would like to refer to works that are underway in INRA on tomato variety selections, where varieties have been created for a multi-resistant tomato with good organoleptic qualities. And this work was first of all focused on short circuits, and then it was promoted for long circuit commercialization in long circuits. So the two are not opposed, but they require adaptations, above all for marketing or the prices offered in long circuits. Thank you very much. Before we see this complementarity in Tunisia, I would like Christelle, because you talked a lot about technical innovation that is emerging locally in short circuits, and I would like Christelle to talk to us about social innovation, what we consider to be social innovation in the Parc de la Baronnie, around a concept that we call transitory population. So this involves tourism. So I said that this morning that one of the conclusions in this group is that tourism was one of the vectors of local food sufficiency, because there's a very strong demand of local produce. And I know it's a rather complicated subject, but I would like you to understand how they approach this question in their territory, what actions are undertaken, but also with a critical eye regarding what was their initial idea and then what worked and what didn't work. Over to you. So first of all, thank you for the invitation. The question that arose when our park was created recently, because it was created in 2014, was how could we bring our territory alive, and how could we really enhance its value? So I'm showing you this map. You can see that we're over 2 different departments, 2 different regions. 2/3 is in the Drôme. There are 34,000 inhabitants. That's not a great deal, so that means that we have a large surface area, but that is very scarcely populated. We'll see afterwards that there is a lot of farming. So the basic question was not from the food standpoint, but how can we really bring this territory alive and really enhance its value? So how can we bring it alive? Meaning, how can we forge links in the territory? How can we ensure its socio-economic vitality and to grow its value, to ensure that Baronnie exists beyond the boundaries of the Baronnie? So the question was, how do we go about this? It so happens that we have a lot of agricultural production in the Baronnie that benefit from quality labels. That's a wonderful lever. I might talk about it afterwards, but I can't list them all, but you know a lot of them. There's the Petit Épeautre, the Nuance Olive, citron lamb, apricots, there's AOC for wines. So we thought that this could be a wonderful lever. First of all, to be known beyond our borders with these transitory populations, which are wonderful ambassadors, and also tremendous lever really to bring the territory alive locally, so to create links around these productions and consolidate or reinstall short circuits for the local population so that they could actually benefit from this local production. So we undertook a number of actions that I will explain later. The idea for us was not to approach this solely via the agricultural and food angle, but also to put the spotlight on all the know-how that surrounds this. So we implemented a certain number of actions in this direction, which targeted not only the transitory populations, but the local populations also. So the idea was to raise awareness amongst inhabitants and, of course, tourists with a number of actions. So one action, for example, that we implemented for the first time this year was called the Agricultural Spring. And the idea... Lunchtime? No, not for us, not yet. So the agricultural spring. Our ambition was to really put the spotlight on all of this production for local inhabitants and tourists, and we created an event throughout the entire area. And we also ensured that the farmers met each other, because when the area is so large, they don't necessarily know each other. If they work in the same sector, they do, but not if they work in different sectors. So we also created a time for them so they could meet each other, they could talk about their practices, their difficulties, and to find possible synergies. Then we worked a lot with the educational sector, above all with the school canteens, working around the products that can be used in the kitchen. But we took the children to visit the farmers to see how we grow food. And we're doing a lot of work with Egalim, but also around food waste. So we're working hard on that point. And a lot of partnerships forged with professionals, in particular restaurants, to make sure that they use local produce. And also with people who look after accommodation. So we work, they offer gift baskets to their guests. With local produce. Also, we worked around gastronomy or fine foods, and we organized a chef's picnic in Avignon. So we working with a few well-known chefs to work on apricots and olives. And in October, there will be an event in the Parliament where we will be cooking them a meal with our local produce. So we've also labelled certain producers, but also people offering accommodation with very strict specifications regarding the quality of the produce offered and the quality of the accommodation. So I've no doubt forgotten some things, but... and of course, a territorial food plan. The other question was we have 34,000 inhabitants, so we didn't wonder how we could feed our population, because actually our local production would be sufficient to feed this population. But we wondered how we can ensure that the production of the Baronnies could be sold beyond our boundaries. So, transitory population, what was our definition behind us? For us, this is people who are just passing through. That means people who have holiday homes. There are about 7,000 holiday homes in the area. It's all of the camping sites, hotels, that's 24,000 beds per year, nights. And this is what we call the transitory population. Now, about the difficulties. So we have basic difficulties because our area is well known, and yet we're quite remote. So the first problem we have is transport, logistics, because short circuits are not within a distance of 3 kilometers. It's a lot further. And we live in a mountainous area, so there's a real logistic problems there. And the second thing, which should not be a problem for us, but it should be economically, is the size of the farms. Because it's a mountainous area, the farms are quite small. Therefore, the economic model is very different from what we find, for example, in the Rhone Valley. This also means that we had to find a system to really stand out. And I'm thinking in particular of apricots, where we have an IGP that is being developed in order to bring added value. So that was true for many different produce, because we can't count on volumes considering the size of the farms and the geographical constraints. And this is why we've really concentrated on labels for our productions, AOCs, IGPs. The positive side is that it really put the spotlight on productions that nobody was really considering, such as what they call the petit épeautre, and also lime flowers, which we use for tisane, and the spelt. Then, regarding the results of our endeavours, it's still early days, but we can see that the work that we've been doing since 2015 is starting to bear fruit. And that's, we're having results for different produce, of course, and that's what we're trying to do. So when we chatted to prepare the round table, and you summarize your approach with the expression, the territory in your plate. So I think there will be other people participating in the next round table, and they explain their experience of the park in the municipality of Madrid. And their motto is "Eat for laborada." So yes, absolutely, it's an expression. Maybe we should use it as our slogan. We haven't done that, but yes, that's what it is. It's like, thinking the territory through your plate. Everything revolves around what you can eat, what you can drink, and showing the territory through this light, because of course it's not the only aspect, but it's one of the main levers. It's the territory in your plate, and wherever you are, there is some local production that we can offer. And that's also what we're trying to do via the ambassadors, the tourists or people who are passing through, who are eager to taste local produce, and they recommend it to people even elsewhere. And then there is the work that we're doing with the world of fine foods. And this will be my last question before this complementarity between short circuits and long circuits in your territory. In the plate, is there this complementarity between short and long circuits to prolong the experience of the territory beyond your territory? Yes, we really do have both. We have some productions that are really very local short circuits, but generally we do find both. We find a mix of short and long circuits. Lamb is a good example. Olive oil, the Nyons olive is found very locally, and we find this everywhere with wine and AOCs. It's wine that we find even beyond, outside of France. So yes, there is a mix. for apricots too. But the apricots are also found in the long circuits because it's sold in Germany and in the east of Europe. So yes, we do have both. And we've managed quite a few years ago now, some 15 or so years ago, because I'm talking of apricots because it's very emblematic. In supermarkets, we found apricots that came from everywhere except from our area. So we said, well, there's a problem because we do have producers that are 15 kilometers away from the closest supermarkets. So we made sure that we could find our apricots in our local stores. Maybe you could just quickly explain how you encourage local supermarkets to stock local produce. Well, we didn't prepare that question, but it would be good to answer it. Well, the first actions, that goes back to prior to the creation of the park. We were just preparing for the creation of the park. We went to talk with these supermarkets and the central purchasing centres to make sure that all of our local produce was referenced in the local supermarkets. That was a very first action. Then the one which we still do today is to make sure that all of these produce, as far as possible, are also used by local restaurants. So mass catering or restaurants? Both. Yes, really both. No distinction between the two. So, of course, school canteens is very important, but restaurants, that's the first thing you see when you come for a holiday in the territory, or when you're passing through. And the park label, that's one of the latest actions, which is also a visual means of better communicating on our local produce. Just to conclude, with regard to the sourcing, in yesterday's roundtable, another of your colleagues talked about how the local chefs weren't familiar with the local produce and how this all had to be developed. So did you organize the fact of creating links between consumers and producers? Yes, I think we did more or less the same thing. Actually, we really did a lot of public relations around our products by sending our produce to the chefs and say, well, look, try these. And yes, of course, we worked also with the general public, which you can see in the latest initiative, which is the event we've organized called the Agricultural Spring. And we worked a lot with the park and the press as well. Yes, that was bringing people together. So we'll see how this complementarity between long and short circuits is approached in Tunisia. And we have Lamia is going to explain to us talk to us about a specific product, the tomato, and historically how things went. Thank you. So I'm going to talk about the Tunisian experience, and the experience of a small region in the peri-urban area of the governorate of Naboul. Here we have the map with the governorate and the plain of Haroui, which is between two forests. It's a plain that, to begin with, the hydrologists were very interested in because there is a problem of water scarcity. There's also another important question in this region, that is the spreading urbanization. It's also a region that's very interesting for local tourism. And there's tremendous potential for a development of wind energy also. So this plain covers 14,350 hectares, and it is located to the north of the Cap Bon, which has a lot of potential for market gardening. So historically, this region, there was a lot of market gardening, and they started growing tomatoes in the 60s. To begin with, this represented a lot of crops with 50% of the surface area. Currently, the surface areas for tomatoes only represent 17%. So there was the progressive replacement of tomatoes by other crops in order for different reasons. Maybe we will come back to that if we have time. But this is how things stand. So this crop, which was very significant in the past, was also behind the creation of a processing industry, which produced double tomato concentrate, which is highly used in Tunisian diet and still is. But this product is also very important for the export market. So we eat a lot of it and we export a lot of this tomato concentrate to Africa. And more recently, we're also present in Europe, in Canada, and increasingly. So this processed product is very important. And we have three types of productions currently. We have fresh tomatoes, which are above all for the local market. So it is for local consumption. And it is a product that is commercialized in circuits that are not short, although it is intended for consumption in the larger region. So for the peri-urban areas and the cities, but even to supply peri-urban sectors, we have to go through wholesale markets that are outside the peri-urban area. Therefore, even the local market is done via circuits that are not short. There is a certain small-scale processing of tomatoes that is done at the local level, because traditionally people ate tomatoes that were cooked or used in the families. So we still have that tradition. There is therefore a very small-scale local processing. But most of the tomatoes go through the wholesale market or go through processing circuits. But these are short circuits because the farmers work with collection centers that work with processing plants. And therefore, at least one or two intermediates between the producer and these factories. Then the tomato concentrate is either sold locally by wholesalers, and there are different types of wholesalers, or it might be exported. So this processing sector is highly integrated. There's a very high level of integration because the processors are also can have collection centers. They might be suppliers of raw materials, and they're also wholesalers and retailers at once. So there's very strong integration even at the local level within this sector. So I'm going to come back to the questions of the duality between the mixed sectors, because it targets both the local market and the export market. So something else that has been created recently is the export of dried tomatoes, and this follows from a demand from Italy. The Italians love dried tomatoes. And so they turned to our region because we have a very specific terroir. And this is what has also allowed us to maintain our tomato production, because it has declined, but there is still a minimum amount of production because we have produced tomatoes that have a very high price, which are bricks, which also allows us to improve quality. So, and it also allows us to produce dried tomatoes. So I must also say that regarding the fresh tomato consumption sector, what is important is that this sector benefits from the very best quality. So therefore, the best quality products are given over to fresh production, and the lesser quality products are put into the processing sector. So all of the technical development that has been achieved by improving the varieties, by improving cropping techniques, by improving quality throughout the entire distribution circuit has benefited local consumption of fresh tomatoes. And this benefit has also been given rise to better prices for fresh tomatoes on the local market than for tomatoes sold for processing, because the price of tomatoes for processing are controlled prices. Therefore, there is an agreement between the UTAP, which is the Farmers' Union, the Processors' Union, and the Ministry of Agriculture on the pricing for tomatoes for processing. So these two sectors coexist. You talked about the technical innovation between long circuits and short circuits, so different processings of and different types of products. So, for example, dried tomatoes. Are there also technical and social innovations that find their roots in the short circuits and that can be upscaled to the long circuits? Well, actually, the growing interest for dried tomatoes has had an impact on the development of short circuits at the local level and even at the national level, because this dried tomato was traditionally a product that was eaten by Tunisians, but with the development of the tomato concentrate industry, it was kind of left to one side. So the renewed interest for this product means that farmers came together to participate in this business, and now there are small co-ops run by women who make dried tomatoes and sell these in short circuits on markets or trade fairs or through social networks or even mail orders. So there are certain circuits that have been developed thanks to this sector. So the problem is that in Tunisia, there isn't really a commercial policy that encourages the development of this type of circuit. So there isn't really a commercial organization. The Ministry of Agriculture doesn't have a commercial policy for agricultural produce, and the Ministry of Trade and Commerce only intervenes in the wholesale market. So all of this commercial question has been somewhat neglected, and that's a real concern within agricultural sectors, because the farmers don't have the know-how to market their produce, and the commercialization is practically always managed by intermediaries. Sometimes even in the weekly markets, when the farmer comes along to sell their produce, they sell it to an intermediary and then they go back home. They don't even try to sell directly to consumers. And therefore, the commercialization remains an important problem to grow the value of short circuits at the local level.
Yes, that was a subject which we were talking about yesterday in the third roundtable, the role of infrastructures and mediators and intermediaries, if you like. I don't know if you'd like to add anything else? I would just like to say that there is technological innovation. From the nurseries, for example, they are introducing new varieties of tomato. They're looking for new techniques for growing their plants. So the expansion of the nurseries, which are more numerous in the region, and they're growing in the region because the climate is right for these nurseries. The winter is very mild. So the growth of the number and size of nurseries is advantageous to the consumption of locally grown produce because we see more varieties, more choices, better quality, and top quality produce sells much better in the local market rather than in the processing industry. I think I've said all I wanted to say. Thank you very much. I haven't even invited questions. There are already questions popping up from the floor. I work for INRA, Bernard Hubert. I've got a question about, just so I understand things. The dried tomatoes, who dries the tomatoes? They are dried in the sun. So it's women who are employed by the factories to cut the tomatoes, salt them, and to lay them out in the sunshine. But it's at the factory then. The same factories? No, these are different factories. It's not the processing factories, no, because we don't really need much technology. It's simply a very basic process, cutting the tomatoes, salting them, and laying them out in the sunshine to dry. So you don't need many pieces of technology or technical skill, which is why it's done by country women, and that's how it managed to grow so quickly. But they work for an industrialist or a small-scale business person. They're not self-employed. Well, the dried tomato industry was started by a company that produced dried tomatoes to export them. But after that, the business was developed by farmers, both male and female, who changed their own production business, or they would buy tomatoes from farmers and they would sell those dried tomatoes on the local market. Because we're talking about dried tomatoes, earlier on someone else was talking about apricot. Is it the same technique to dry apricots as to dry tomatoes? Well, thank you for this question. I'm going to disappoint you because I do not know. And that will enable me to add a point which I forgot to mention earlier on. Unlike in other regions, we are fortunate enough to have a lot of production, but we have very little processing done in our region. Apart from wine, for example, the products which we sell are raw products. So for apricots, well, there's perhaps a tiny bit of apricot drying in the region, but apricots are mainly sold fresh as they are. Thank you very much to all of the speakers. It was a wonderful round table, really interesting. I would just like to share my thoughts on, how can I put this, on how the players are positioned, depending on whether they're on a long or a short circuit, and they are economic players. They've all got to look out their own interests, and wherever they are, there might be opportunities to seize. So if it's better for them to go to a long circuit that will enable them to sell their goods on more quickly, more easily, without spending too much time doing the sales and marketing, well, it could be an opportunity. There may be no opposition to that. It's not negative if you compare it to a specific product or a specific fruit or vegetable which can be sold on a shorter circuit, because there just happens to be an opportunity there because they can accumulate more added value. So I come from Guadeloupe, slightly different from the regions you've been describing. We are an island, and we have a lot of producers who play at several levels. They use several strategies all at the same time. Often they combine strategies. They use the short circuits, they use the long circuits, depending on the different time lapses, which will be different in high season, low season, depending on supply and demand. And though the producers play one channel off against another, and they grasp opportunities as they present themselves, some choose not to spend much of their time selling. They prefer to produce and then just get rid of the stuff as quickly as possible. So the question of the diversity of what you can produce at a farm also plays a big role in those decisions. Earlier on, there was a correlation made between diversity and I can't remember what the term was used, but for me, it's also a question of it's business. It's linked to the amount of work that it involves going out to sell your own produce, and the relationship between that opportunity of gaining aggregated added value and the quantity of work that requires. So it's just a kind of comment I wanted to throw in there. Hello, I'm Isabelle Lacordaire. I'm a trainer. I train people about biocontrol. So I've got a question about the technical systems and the different itineraries. We're not really hearing much talk about that. We're talking about local production and the number of years it takes to diversify your crops, to reduce the number of inputs. But in terms of the Tunisian tomatoes or the olives or the apricots, all of these crops suffer from bioaggressors. My question is, in your different projects, in what you're deploying, are there specific specs about how you protect the crops? We've talked about agroforestry, agroecology, but I've not heard you speak about this. I just want to know what the situation is in your different organizations. Well, I could speak about this. As far as our tomatoes are concerned, in the integrated circuit, i.e. the most important circuit, which involves those smaller scale farmers, there are specifications which are drawn up by the intermediaries who collect the tomatoes and hand them on to the processors. So there are specifications about, and there's also inspections. They are given all of the raw materials that they need to grow the tomatoes, so there's quite a good control over that. For the apricots and olives, well, yes, there is help at hand. The park's role, its responsibility, is not necessarily to define the specifications. Our role is more to help the different business sectors and the players for them to understand how they can add value to their products. As far as labels are concerned, there are the specs, there's the help, and there are also the chambers of agriculture which can help, and that they all play a role inside the park. And if we have a grower, a farmer, we help them with all of these processes, and we introduce them to the right people. As far as Morocco is concerned and those inputs, no, there's no inspections, no control whatsoever. For the transformation, the processing side, yes, to ensure that the quality of the olive oil is good, yes, but upstream, on a practical day-to-day basis, no, there is no strict control and there are no specifications. But there are some products which are forbidden in your country. Few, there are very few, but we don't really take any heed of that. This year, however, we have started for mint, for example. There was a bit of a scandal about mint, and so now we've banned a few farms from selling their mint. That's the first time we've introduced anything like that. I imagine that if you do organics for the European Union, for example, there must be some kind of inspection or control. There must be specifications. Well, it's not compulsory. If we say if our growers want to do organic produce, then they have to respect specifications. It's their choice. In my unit, we feel that it's important to underline that diversifying your crops is not enough. It's not a guarantee that more ecological practices will be deployed. It's important to think about how you organize your crops in space and over time. And as far as market gardening is concerned, how you protect your crops is really important. For other types of production, I don't really have the experience to talk about that. I would say that we've been talking with colleagues about local food supplies, breeding animals, for example. I've got one colleague who was saying that given the high expectations of consumers pertaining to short-circuit produce, that could have repercussions on how the flock is fed or how the herd is fed. And the relationship between consumers and breeders are very important. But I don't really have a lot to say on that score. Yes, I just wanted to come back about those inspections. Yes, they're done downstream by the consumers, by the Canadians, for example, who will test all the quantities and stuff. So these inspections, these controls are carried out by the importers, not by the local authority. I got a question. I wanted to come back to this example of dried tomatoes. You explained that it's a new business activity and there's a processor that created that demand. And you said that that industrial demand has triggered a local activity with many women who have started to produce and sell the dried tomatoes. And as far as the consumers are concerned, if those products are quite new, what kind of demand was there from the local consumers? And given that there now is a business sector devoted to dried tomatoes, is that generating new consumption in the region? Or did people always used to take dried tomatoes, but they would buy them from imported sources? Dried tomatoes are a traditional foodstuff in Tunisia. When you hear people talk about dried tomatoes, I never had them when I was little, personally, but we all heard about them and we all heard how very good it is for your health compared to other processed ingredients such as this tomato puree or tomato concentrate, where there are a lot of preservatives in there. And so consumers are interested in the nutritional value, although we may not have a tradition of consuming the dried tomatoes. However, there's increasing enthusiasm for products that are good for health, particularly when you hear about all of the problems that people are having with their health, being overweight, having high blood pressure, having cardiovascular diseases. So Tunisian consumers are now becoming very sensitive to the quality of the food they eat. I would like to know, for Morocco, I saw a video a few years ago and I was horrified when I saw it. It was 2 years ago. It was the Farmers' Federation which went to support SAIDI. There was a social uprising about these workers who were ill-treated when they worked on the land. And I want to know how your small-scale farmers stand on this, because there's all these big Spanish and other countries are invested in Morocco who were producing products which are full of pesticides, and those products were coming back onto the local market where I live and is being sold on small local markets, often by people from North Africa. It's really painful. It was exploitation from one end of the chain to the other. So I don't know what the situation is like today. I think it's horrendous that your politicians, I always say this when I see Moroccan patients, I always say to them, you have the expertise, you have no pollution, you've got great land, you've got these idiotic politicians who are spoiling everything. So what do people realize what's happening? Everything was there. They could have you just need to train people a little bit and help them to sell the fruit of their labour better. It's horrendous. Tell me how things are. Can you give me some words of comfort on this score? I'm afraid I've not got very much to say. I just can agree with what you've said. We are starting to talk about the dangers, but in practical terms, well, sadly, not seeing anything happening. It is a waste, a huge waste. I would just like to add, earlier on, Asta was asking me about technical innovations. Unlike there's INRA in Morocco, for example, in Marrakesh, and they have managed to enhance the plants.
So they have greater yields than the former varieties. So, but the Morocco Green Plan, there are researchers that have worked within the local Moroccan context, unfortunately. So maybe a final question, and then we will break for lunch. Katia Sieg, I'm an urbanist and landscaper. I would like to know, within the territorial food plan of the Baronnies region, do you have any data on the consumption of local inhabitants? Because products that benefit from a label obviously are intended for export or tourism. Is there market gardening, and is it easy to buy everyday food, produce, or do local inhabitants not tend to shop more in supermarkets in your region? Well, it's a good question. That's what's so tricky. And that is part of the work that we're trying to do. So, of course, there are still people who shop in supermarkets. And we can't prevent that. And we can't oblige local people to only buy local produce. However, the labelled produce are not intended solely for export. And I'm sorry I talk a lot about apricots, but it's true because these are easy to buy, especially in supermarkets, and sometimes the prices are actually quite reasonable with regard to what you find elsewhere. And they can also be bought in local grocery stores, because as we're very scattered out, there are also a lot of small local grocery stores. And in school canteens also, and the same thing is true for meat. So we try to help producers to ensure that their production can be sold and is made available to local inhabitants, and not just for the export market. But it's not easy. When a production does benefit from a label, that comes at a cost. And that might be a problem as well, because there's a question of purchasing power. And to eat better is all very good, but you have to have the means to do so. And I think that is really at the heart of the subject. It's not the only thing, but it's very important. So I don't yet have those figures, but let's say that we're making progress on this question. For example, we eat a lot of our local spelt, but not everything is easily accessible, and we still find produce in supermarkets that is not seasonal, and therefore necessarily it's not local. But things are getting better. At least we're trying, and that's really one of the main objectives of our work within the scope of what the park can do, because we can't solve all of the problems, but it is to help producers so that they can make headway on these questions. I don't know if I've really answered your question, but to add, Mr. Hubert from INRA, maybe you can find local labeling mechanisms which are less costly, because the AOC IGP certification is made for export, and so that people who live far away from that region really does come from that region, and that respects the specifications. Therefore, there is a cost, but it's made to guarantee that in Paris, Frankfurt, and New York, the Roquefort does come from Roquefort, or apricots, which is an IGP barony, does come from the barony. When you're on site, you don't necessarily need these very costly certification processes. You might very well have participative labeling processes by peers that guarantee that in the shops, local shops, that the produce are guaranteed from being local products without necessarily going through the official labeling procedures or certification procedures. There can be evaluations because those labels and certifications are to ensure that at the other side of the world we know that these products do come from that place. But locally we don't need all of this labeling. So we could imagine another system. Well, you're absolutely right. You are so right. If not, that we must recall that the certification and labeling process is done by the sectors themselves. It's not the park that has initiated the process. So it's because they want their production to stand out from others beyond the borders of our territory. But therefore, this allows me to add something that I forgot to say earlier on, and I don't know at what point I had this question, but on the park brand, which is a way of differentiating the product. So that's far more local, and that's far simpler, with far simpler specifications. So that does exist. We've just started it, so we certified a few producers, in particular for lamb, and a few people who offer accommodation. So not all of our local producers work in the short circuits, and therefore that's why they want to achieve this certification, and a different sort of certification.